Lewis Hayden, the slave who swore to kill kidnappers, 1844, Boston, 1844. The city boiled with tensions between slaves and abolitionists. The fugitive slave law transformed men, women, and children into easy targets for reward hunters. But in Lewis Hayden's small house, the story was going another way. Kentucky's former slave, he had a pact with himself and with freedom. He would never allow his wife and children to be taken back to the chains. Hayden not just branding words. He said he kept gunpowder barrels at his home and warranty. If they come to pick me up, we will all explode together. This promise of fire and death echoed like thunder. Boston was no longer just a northern city. It became a bastion of resistance. Before you board this story of courage and terror, think, from where you are now, what would you sacrifice to protect your freedom and your family? Subscribe to the channel and answer in the comments. Was Lewis Hayden a desperate man or a true resistance hero? In 1844, Kentucky's air seemed denser than ever to Lewis Hayden. The dust that rose under the horses' hooves and the suffocating heat of summer were only shadows of the true weight it carried: slavery. Lewis, a man of imposing presence and resolute look, felt every chain that held him as an affront to his dignity and the promise of freedom that his heart insisted on whispering. He woke up every day to the sound of the forefront, but within him, a deeper and silent scream crying out for justice. The farm where he lived was a vast length of land, with endless cotton rows. The work was exhaustive, and the hope of a better future seemed to fade with each dusk. However, at night, when the world seemed to fall asleep, Lewis and his wife Harriet whispered escape plans under the pale light of the moon. His eyes shone with determination, a glow that neither hard work nor despair could erase. Lewis, who had a sharp mind and innate leadership skill, began to architect a bold plan. He knew the escape would not be easy. Patrollers were always vigilant, and the slave master's informant network was extensive. However, Lewis was not a man who was easily intimidated. He knew every corner of the property and the surroundings like the palm of his hand, and began to draw escape routes, observing the standards of the guards, mentally writing every detail that could make the difference between freedom and capture. The night chosen for the escape was one of the darkest that Kentucky has ever seen. The stars could barely pierce the black veil of the sky. Lewis and Harriet, firmly holding the hand of the little son Joseph, moved as shadows through the fields. The silence was broken only by the sound of his cautious steps over the moist grass by dew. Lewis's heart was beating hard, not just for the fear of capture, but for the hope of a new beginning. It was a huge risk, but the alternative, living the rest of his days in captivity, was unbearable. The journey to freedom was long and full of dangers. Each crack of branch under its feet seemed a thunder, every movement in the dark, an invisible threat. But Lewis had something that patrols and slave owners had not: the unqualified desire to live free. Along the way, they found others who, like them, longed for freedom. United by the same dream, they formed a small fugitive community, each with their own stories of pain and resilience. The Ohio River, which marked the border between captivity and freedom, appeared before them at dawn, their waters reflecting the promise of a new day. The crossing was one of the most tense moments of their lives. With each row, they left behind not only the land that imprisoned them, but also the invisible currents trying to subdue their spirits. As they reached the opposite bank, Lewis felt reborn. The air seemed different, lighter, and for the first time in a long time he breathed deeply, like a free man. But freedom was not the end of his journey. Lewis knew that many were still chained, and their hearts cried out for justice. The escape was not just a personal victory. It was the first step in a greater fight against oppression. He promised himself that he would do everything to his power to destroy the system that enslaved them. With his safe family, Lewis prepared for the next phase of his life, that of a warrior for freedom, a man who would not rest until all his brothers and sisters could walk freely under the same sky. In 1850, the air was loaded with tension and fear. The recently approved fugitive slave law reverberated as a distant but inevitable thunder over all those who had been free from the currents. For Lewis Hayden, agora established in Boston, the city that was synonymous with hope and freedom, the news came as a treacherous blow. The promise of a safe haven had been stained by the cruel reality that, at any time, his life and that of his family could be turned upside down again. Boston, with his brick buildings and narrow streets, was a place of resistance and solidarity, but also a fertile ground for easily profit, eager reward hunters. In that fall, the golden leaves fell from the trees, covering the sidewalks with a beauty that contrasted with the climate of apprehension between the black community. The city, which housed about 136,000 people, seemed smaller under the weight of this new threat. Lewis, with his eyes full of determination, did not allow himself to be paralyzed by fear. He knew that the struggle for freedom did not end with his escape. She just took new forms. The law of the fugitive slave made any black man a target, and he was determined but hunted again. He was actively involved with the Black Surveillance Society, an organization dedicated to protecting fugitive slaves and resisting attempts to capture them. Lewis, with his imposing presence and leadership skill, quickly became an authority and inspiration figure within the group. The street where he lived, with Harriet and Joseph, was a microcosm of resistance. Their neighbors, many of them also fugitives, shared stories of courage and survival strategies. They organized secret meetings on Saturday nights, where they discussed plans to protect each other and elaborate escape routes for those who were still under threat. With each meeting, Lewis watched the brightness in the eyes of his companions, a reflection of the fire that burned inside him. First big test came on a cold morning of November. A group of armed men, led by an infamous reward hunter named Jonathan Blake, broke into a neighboring house, pulling out a family Lewis knew well. The screams and desperate resistance echoed down the street as a painful reminder of the fragility of his freedom. Lewis watched, powerless but determined, while the family was taken, the children crying, and the mother begging for mercy. This incident did not break Lewis's spirit. On the contrary, he burned his determination. He knew he could not rely only on secret encounters and words of encouragement. Direct action was necessary. With the support of the Black Surveillance Society, Lewis began to plan. They established a warning system using signs of smoke and flashlights on specific windows to warn the neighborhood about the presence of reward hunters. Lewis also began training his companions in self-defense techniques and evasion tactics. He remembered his own escape, the ability he had to move silently and the knowledge of the land, and took the opportunity to strengthen the community. With each training session, he reinforced the idea that freedom was not just a right, a responsibility, and that each of them had a duty to protect each other. The weeks turned into months, and Lewis became a legendary figure among those who longed for freedom. According to reports of the time, he was able to thwart several capture attempts, using his intelligence and courage to deceive the hunters of rewards and ensure that no one was taken against his will. Witnesses decades later remembered their presence as that of a lighthouse of hope in dark times, a man whose determination to see his free people knew no limits. However, each victory had a cost. Constant tension, the need to always be alert, weighed on him and his family. Harriet, although proud of her husband, lived with the constant fear that he could be captured or worse. Joseph, now a curious and intelligent young man, was beginning to understand the severity of the situation, but was also inspired by his father, dreaming of a world where he would never need to fear for freedom. The fugitive slave law was a brutal reality, an attempt by the government to repress the spirit of resistance that grew between former slaves and their allies. But Lewis Hayden was not a man who was easily folded. For him, each day was a new battle, each victory a new promise that freedom, though fragile, was an inalienable right. He would continue to fight, not only for himself and his family, but for all those who were still chained by fear and oppression. And with each act of resistance, he wrote his name in history as a symbol of courage and unshakable determination. In 1851, the streets of Boston seemed to be a chessboard where each movement needed to be accurately calculated. A city that once offered the promise of freedom was now full of hidden dangers. And for Lewis Hayden, the battle for survival became more complex every day. Rumors about Hayden's house, located in the busy Southack Street, began to spread around the city like an uncontrolled fire. They said he had turned his house into a fortress, protected by gunpowder barrels, ready to blow up to the smallest sign of invasion. The legend of gunpowder barrels was not just a defense strategy, but an audacious statement of resistance. For Lewis, it was crucial for reward hunters to know that any attempt to capture their family or those under their protection would result in devastating consequences. The house, with its robust walls and always closed windows, had become a symbol of challenge, a lighthouse of hope for many, and a clear warning to those who dare threaten their freedom. This audacity did not arise out of nowhere. Lewis spent clear nights, planning and arguing with Harriet the possible repercussions of his strategy. They knew that living under the constant threat of explosion was a heavy burden, but they considered a small price to pay for freedom. Harriet, with her wisdom and silent strength, supported Lewis's every decision, even if it meant living with the constant fear that a false step could take everything through the air. Inside the house, life followed a tense but resilient rhythm. Joseph, now 12, was instructed about the exact location of the barrels and the importance of never talking about them outside the four walls they called home. He looked at his father with admiration and a growing understanding of the complexities of the world in which they lived. Lewis and Harriet ensured that Joseph understood the severity of his situation, but also encouraged him to dream of a future where he did not need to fear for his safety. The community around Hayden's house was a microcosm of resistance. The neighbors, many of which are also fugitives, saw the house not only as a physical fortress, but as a symbol of protection and hope. On Saturdays, in the light of candles, they gathered to discuss protection strategies and share information about the movements of reward hunters. In these meetings, Lewis's presence was a stabilizing force, and his words, a fuel that fed the spirit of collective resistance. The months passed, and the tension in the city was palpable. Jonathan Blake, the reward hunter who had devastated the house neighboring months earlier, became obsessed with the idea of capturing Lewis. Blake, a man with cold-eyed and relentless determination, saw in the barrels of gunpowder a personal challenge. He knew that capturing Hayden would not be just a financial achievement, but a significant blow against the resistance he represented. On a cloudy day of September, Blake gathered his men in a nearby tavern, discussing his plans in a low voice to take Hayden's house. They were prepared for everything except for Lewis's ingenuity and courage. When the news of Blake's plans hit Hayden's ears, he knew he needed to act. That night, he and Harriet argued fervently until they decided on a plan that could once again ensure the safety of their family and friends. The next day, while Blake and his men approached the house, a group of loyal neighbors, Hayden, began to appear on the streets, walking with determination, their serious expressions warning that they would not give up without fighting. Lewis, watching the window, felt a wave of pride and gratitude for those who were willing to risk everything for him and his family. As the reward hunters approached, the sound of a warning scream echoed all over the street. Lewis, determined to defend his home and family, emerged from the gateway, his imposing and unshakable stance. "Do you want my house? Come, but know that she will explode the moment they cross the threshold," he said, his voice clear and without hesitation. Blake hesitated, his men nervously looking at each other. The threat was clear, and everyone knew Lewis Hayden was not a man of headlights. In an instant of freezing tension, the fate of many was suspended in the air. But in the face of Hayden's collective community and audacity, Blake retreated, realizing that the risk was greater than the reward. The removal of the reward hunters was a silent but powerful triumph. For Lewis and his family, it was a reminder that the struggle for freedom was continuous, but that together it was inabalable. Hayden's gunpowder has become a living legend, a story of courage and resistance that would resonate through the ages, inspiring future generations to fight for justice and freedom. And so, in the heart of Boston, amid the shadows of oppression, a light of resistance continued to shine intensely. In 1852, the promise of freedom in Boston was an echo fair for many. But for Lewis Hayden, the struggle for survival and dignity was a daily reality. With each step taken on the cobblestone streets, he carried with him the weight of a deadly oath. A promise made not only himself, but to all who shared his view of a world without chains. "If they come to take me, we will all explode together," he had declared. And these words reverberated not only in the minds of slave hunters, but also in the hearts of those who longed for freedom. That winter, the city was covered by a snow cloak that softened the hard lines of the buildings and momentarily softened the hardness of life. But under this facade of tranquility, the tension was palpable. Slave hunters continued to prowl, like wolves on the lurking, their fixed eyes on Hayden's house, attracted by the promise of reward and the fame that the capture of this legendary man would bring. For Lewis, the snow was not a peace blanket, but a reminder that time was passing and that the fight was far from over. The heat inside the house contrasted with the sharp cold outside. The walls, who witnessed whispers of resistance and survival plans, now kept a tense silence. Harriet, always next to Lewis, kept the flame of hope on. She knew they lived in a gunpowder barrel, both literally and figuratively, but her determination was as fierce as her husband's. Together they planned each movement, assessing each risk, aware that a mistake could be fatal. Joseph, now 13, absorbed each lesson, every resistance story told around the table. He looked at his parents with admiration and understood that his education was a powerful weapon in the struggle for freedom. Each night, before bedtime, he repeated in silence his father's oath, like a mantra of resistance and courage. The community around Hayden's house, though fragmented by fear, was beginning to join more strongly. There was a tacit understanding that the protection of one was the protection of all. Secret meetings became more frequent, and on these nights, the candlelight cast dancing shadows while strategies were discussed and promises of aid were signed. Lewis, with his magnetic presence, guided these meetings, instilling hope and courage in each word. Winter advanced, and slave hunters, led again by Jonathan Blake, did not give up on his goal. Blake, a man whose heart seemed as cold as the ice that covered the streets, saw in Lewis a trophy to be conquered. He was a predator in search of his prey, and the legend of the barrels of gunpowder only sharpened his determination. In his mind, capturing Hayden meant more than financial success. It was a matter of pride and power. On a particularly cold night, rumors of an imminent plan for capturing Lewis arrived in their ears. A faithful informant, a young man named Nathaniel, brought the news under the cloak of darkness. "They come to dawn," he whispered, the breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Lewis heard. His mind is already spinning with possibilities and strategies. He knew time was against them, but he also knew that courage and cunning were his most valuable allies. That night, Lewis gathered his family and the nearest neighbors. The atmosphere was loaded with tension, but also of a fierce determination. "If they come," Lewis said, his voice firm, "we will not be easily taken. This is our home, and we will fight for him. If we explode, let us be a resistance headlight for all those who are still chained." Harriet held her hand, the look full of love and understanding. "We are with you, Lewis," she said, her soft but full of strength. Joseph, next to them, raised his chin, determined to show that, despite his age, he was ready to defend his home and his family. The hours dragged slowly until dawn, every heavy second with the expectation of what was to come. When the first light of day began to emerge on the horizon, a feeling of calm took over Lewis. He was prepared not only with gunpowder and plans, but with the certainty that his fight was just and necessary. The footsteps approached, and then, like a distant thunder, the sound of boots against the newly packed snow filled the air. Blake and his men appeared on the street, their threatening silhouettes against the pale sky. Lewis went out to the porch, his eyes finding Blake's. "This is our last warning," said Blake, his sharp voice. "Deliver yourself, and your friends will not have to suffer." Lewis, unshakable, looked at him. "If they come to take me, we will all explode together," he repeated, his words loaded with a resolution that even shook the hardest men among the hunters. The tension was palpable, like a rope about to break. But something unexpected happened. The people of the houses around C, they omitted to leave, forming a living barrier before the hunters. Men, women, children, all united by the same determination. They were not armed with rifles or knives, but with the unbreakable force of a people who refused to be subdued. The hunters hesitated, surprised by the sudden manifestation of solidarity and courage. Blake, realizing that there was no victory to be won without a terrible cost, retreated. Lewis remained firm, a man whose courage and willingness to fight for justice had turned a simple house into a symbol of resistance. And as the hunters retired, the snow continued to fall, covering the footprints with a cloak of renewed hope. Lewis's promise, "If they come to take me, we will all explode together," he became more than a warning. He became a war for all those who longed for freedom. And so, in the heart of Boston, a new chapter in the struggle for justice and equality was beginning to be written, with Lewis Hayden on the front line, an indomitable warrior in the struggle for freedom. In 1853, Boston became a boiling fervor of abolitionists, and at the epicenter was the imposing figure of Lewis Hayden. The streets, but only paths of bricks and sidewalks, now vibrated with the energy of a people who refused to be subdued. The city, with its majestic architecture and rich history, became a symbol of resistance, a refuge for those who sought a chain-free world. Lewis Hayden's legend and his gunpowder has spread beyond the borders of Boston, echoing across the country. His determination to face slave hunters has become an inspiration to many. The meetings at Hayden's house, which were once discreet meetings, now attracted abolitionists from all corners of America. They were poets, intellectuals, workers, and former slaves, all united by the same cause, the abolition of slavery. The nights at Southack Street were illuminated not only by the lights of the candles, but for the fire of hope and resistance. Lewis, with his natural leadership ability, conducted heated debates, discussing strategies and sharing vital information about slave escape networks. The living room of his house became a center of operations, where maps were spread over tables and plans were traced with the accuracy of a military campaign. Harriet, alongside Lewis, played a crucial role. His presence was like an anchor, bringing calm and focus on the storm of the fight. She organized meetings, took care of the logistical details, and, above all, offered emotional support to those who were on the verge of despair. His silent strength was a lighthouse for many, especially for women who found an ally and leader in it. Joseph's presence, now a 14-year-old, was a constant reminder of the future for which everyone was fighting. He attended meetings, absorbed the lessons, and dreamed of a world where freedom was not a privilege, but a right. Under the guidance of his parents, he began to understand that the struggle for justice demanded not only courage, but also intelligence and compassion. Lewis's influence was not limited to his home. The city's churches, which were the pulsating heart of black communities, echoed with inflamed sermons that called the faithful to action. Pastors and community leaders, inspired by Hayden's example, encouraged their congregations not only to pray, but to act. In schools, teachers taught the next generation about the importance of resistance and equality. Abolitionist newspapers, which circulated clandestinely, often stamped stories about Hayden and their exploits. Articles exalted their courage and urged readers to rise against injustice. In an especially powerful edition, a detailed account of his defense of the gunpowder house served as a call to arms, a call for others to follow his example and resist at all costs. During this period, the city of Boston was on a warning. The tension between abolitionists and slave hunters reached a boiling point. Lewis and his allies knew that the battle would not be overcome with words and meetings. They began to organize night patrols, groups of men and women who monitored the streets, always vigilant against any threat of capture. Each night, while the cloak of darkness covered the city, these vigilantes, armed with flashlights and courage, roamed the streets, attentive to any sign of danger. Lewis often led these patrols, his presence a guarantee that while he was around, resistance would not weaken. The feeling of community and solidarity grew every day. People who were once strange became allies and friends, united by the same cause. Resistance in Boston was no longer just a series of individual actions. It was a cohesive movement, a powerful force that challenged injustice and oppression. However, with each victory, the battle was far from over. Lewis knew that true freedom would require more than just the defense of his home or the protection of his neighbors. It would need a systemic change, a radical transformation that abolishs slavery across the country. And so, while spring rains began to wash the streets of Boston, bringing the promise of renewal, Lewis Hayden remained his tireless struggle. He knew that every small act of resistance, every person inspired by his history, was a step towards a future where freedom would no longer be a distant hope, but a concrete reality for all. Boston, under the leadership of men and women like Lewis Hayden, became more than a city. It became a symbol of resistance and hope. And as Lewis looked at the horizon, he knew that although the way ahead was long and hard, he was not alone. The whole city was with him, willing to fight until all the shackles were broken and each human being could live truly free. In 1854, the legend of Lewis Hayden and his gunpowder home resounded throughout America, more powerful than ever. Although there was never a need to light the wick, the mere existence of this threat became a formidable psychological weapon against slavery. Everywhere, Hayden's story spread like a fire in a dry field, inflaming the determination of the oppressed and sowing fear in the hearts of oppressors. Hayden's house in Boston became a sanctuary, a pilgrimage place for abolitionists who sought inspiration and courage. Each brick of the house seemed to throb with the energy of resistance accumulated over the years. The meetings within their walls became even more intense, attracting notable figures of the abolitionist movement, such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, who came to hear the words of Hayden and feel the power of solidarity he had cultivated. Lewis, now a legendary figure, remained humble and focused on the mission. He understood that his legacy was not just about protecting his own family, but about inspiring an entire generation to fight for freedom. He frequently traveled to other cities, sharing his history and motivating entire communities to come together against injustice. In each place he visited, he made an indelible brand, a spark of resistance that continued to grow even after his departure. The threat of the barrels of gunpowder had become more than a defensive tactic. It was a symbol of uncompromising resistance. For many, Hayden's story was proof that courage and unhealthy will could turn the game against a seemingly invincible system. The words, "If they come to take me, we will all explode together," reverberated not only as a warning, but as a maintenance mantra and bravery. However, Hayden's impact was felt beyond the borders of Boston. The legend of his gunpowder house reached the South, where slaves and plantations heard whispers of hope that a man had dared to face his captors with nothing but the promise of mutual destruction. These rumors fed the determination of slaves, inspiring many to risk everything in search of freedom. Hayden's influence was an invisible but powerful force that continued to challenge the status quo. Meanwhile, in Boston, the fight continued. The city boiled with the activity of the abolitionists. and Lewis was at the center of everything. He led with intelligence and compassion, always looking for new ways to support fugitives and ensure their safety. The network he helped build has become an example of organized resistance, challenging unfair laws and providing a safe path to those who escaped slavery. Lewis also devoted time to teaching and educating the next generation. He knew that the true change began with knowledge and awareness. In schools and churches, he talked about the importance of freedom and equality, inspiring young people like Joseph, dreaming of a future where everyone could live without fear. Education, for Hayden, was one of the most powerful tools in the fight against oppression. As time passed, Hayden's house became not only a symbol of resistance, but also a learning and growth center. Harriet, always next to Lewis, played a vital role, welcoming fugitives and ensuring that everyone feels part of a larger community. Together they created a space where hope flourished, even in the face of adversity. Lewis's presence in the abolitionist struggle was undeniable. Its history, told and retold in newspapers and meetings, inspired actions across the country. In 1854, when the Kansas-Nebraska law rekindled the debate on the expansion that of slavery, Hayden's voice resonated louder than ever. He was firmly positioned against any attempt to compromise black rights, seeing an opportunity to further galvanize the abolitionist movement. Lewis Hayden's influence transcended his time. Not only did he contribute to the abolition of slavery, but also helped shape the future of the United States. Its history has become part of the nation's fabric, an eternal reminder that freedom should never be given as guaranteed, but must be defended with fervor and determination. When you think of Lewis Hayden and her gunpowder, it's not just the image of a man defending his home that comes to mind, but that of a leader whose impact echoed through generations. He showed the world that true strength does not reside in violence, but in the resilience and willingness to fight for what is just. And so, the legacy of Hayden's threat continues to inspire those who seek justice and freedom, ensuring that his flame never erases.